Well, hi. I thought we ought to talk a little bit about the Constitutional Convention tonight. I think it's important to know what the founding fathers, those who were participating in the Constitution, what they wanted, what they intended, and what the outcome was. I don't think it is fair to say that everyone that descended on Philadelphia in May 1787 wanted a strong central government. I think it is fair to say that that was the prevailing sentiment, but there were certainly a vast number, or at least a goodly number, of the participants in this convention who didn't want a strong central government. Remember, all these guys had lived through the American Revolution. They'd seen firsthand what could happen if a government got too big, if a government got too powerful. Goodbye to the liberties, the rights of the people. And they didn't want to see that again. They did recognize that the Articles of Confederation had serious flaws. This League of Friendship wasn't working so well. And they knew they needed to do something. And so the 55 or 56 men, yes, men, that descended on Philadelphia 233 years ago, were looking to create a document that they thought would save the United States, that would keep the United States from dissolving. Now, here again is where foreign affairs figures a prominent part in this. The thought of many of the founding fathers was unless they could come up with some definite compact that would unite the 13 states or colonies into a nation, they were quite concerned that any of the European powers would come to the United States, to America, to the New World, a New World rich in land, rich in resources, rich in raw materials, that these European powers, France, Spain, maybe a second try by England, or some other European power, would come over here and one by one gobble up those independent states. So again, foreign affairs, foreign relations figures a part in what in the urgency of creating a constitution and a national government that had power and some heft behind it. The prominent people that came to Philadelphia, and of course they all thought they were prominent, but George Washington was asked to be the presiding officer, the president of the convention. It was widely thought that Washington's prestige, his fame, and just generally the overall trust that the general public had for George Washington would make the difference. Somebody might have been James Madison who said the one thing about the Constitution that everybody loved was George Washington. Washington is risking a little bit in this, of course, because if it fails, what does that do to his reputation? What does that do to his prestige? But he will be the presiding officer. As such, he could not vote. As such, by the way, except in the case of a tie, as such, the presiding officer, he could not make speeches. He could handle the parliamentary rules of order. He could call on people to speak. He could rule a point was in order or out of order. But really, his greatest contribution was being there. By the way, when they would talk about the office of the presidency, as they were creating that, of course, every eye in the room was looking at the great man to see if he would raise an eyebrow or if he would smile or if there would be any kind of gesture or acknowledgement that he liked something or didn't like something. They knew he was their man as the president of the United States if they could get a final document approved. Of course, Benjamin Franklin, prior to Washington, the most famous American of the 18th century. Franklin is, he's 81 years old. That's old by our standards. It's 3 years older than Joe Biden. It's 7 years older than Donald Trump. Um, in 1787, an 81-year-old man was probably the equivalent of about a 105-year-old man by today's life standards, life expectancy. But Franklin was one of the most famous, probably the most famous American of the 1700s. And needless to say, he needed to be there. He wasn't pretty, he didn't have a lot of movement, as you could imagine, 81. And so what they would do is they would send convicts from Pennsylvania State Prison to his home and lift him onto a sedan chair, basically like almost like a portable throne that he sat on, and these convicts would pick him up and carry this chair, supported by two big staves, take him to the Constitution Hall and leave him there, and then come back, we assume, at about 5 o'clock at night and pick him up. His contribution, also like Washington's, was just being there. You could not have this and have it have any kind of respectability if Benjamin Franklin wasn't present. The movers and shakers, James Wilson from Pennsylvania, a nearsighted Scotsman who pushed very heavily and very vigorously for a strong and vigorous president. James Madison, who we subsequently call the father of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, who, as you know, makes a marvelous musical, but was a very brilliant man. And of course, another New Yorker named John Jay. There were probably other lesser lights, Elbridge Gerry, John Adams. There were some people that weren't there. Thomas Jefferson wasn't there. He was serving in Paris as a minister, or today we'd say ambassador, representing the United States in France. Oh gosh, who's the other one? Patrick Henry would be another one that, give me liberty and give me death. He wasn't there. He boycotted it. The state of Rhode Island refused to send anybody. They were not represented. Kind of laughingly, they called them Rogue Island because they refused to participate. But by and large, here they came. James Madison knew, young man, he was 35 at the time, he knew that if we were going to have a protracted debate about what kind of government we wanted, this thing would blow up. You'd have 55 lawyers in the room arguing and nothing would get done. So Madison prepared a document and basically said, here's what I think it should look like. What do you all think? And so for the next 4 months, the length of the Constitutional Convention, they argued over Madison's plan. We refer to that plan as the Virginia Plan. The plan isn't as important to our conversation. If you want to talk about it, call me, we'll talk about it. Essentially, it created the basic framework for the government we have today, split into three branches: a judicial, an executive, and a legislature. There were parts of the plan they didn't like. And so Roger Sherman from Connecticut came up with a compromise, and they said, boy, we really don't like that. And New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, proposed another alternative plan. The founders hated the New Jersey plan even more. It called for 3 presidents, 1 from each section of the country. And so they hated that one so much, they kind of liked what Roger Sherman offered after all. And the Connecticut Compromise was adopted as the Constitution of the United States. It was then sent back to the various states, to their assemblies for ratification. They needed 75%, or basically 9 of the 13, to say yes. Ultimately, all 13 said yes. Some lobbying, by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. They wrote anonymous newspaper articles in each of the states. Those articles arguing in favor of the Constitution we now call the Federalist Papers. There were 85 or so of those that argued or discussed certain aspects or points of the Constitution. I guess that's enough of the preamble for now. But here's what they were trying to accomplish. They were trying to, and our Constitution, basically, our government is founded under basically the idea of checks and balances. In other words, we are trying to control or balance or check power. These guys that are in Philadelphia in 1787, a decade before, were fighting the British. So don't forget that they were very concerned about giving too much power to the government, and certainly too much power to one person or one branch. They didn't want to go from a king named George to basically a president named George. They were very careful, and every time they would argue about assigning a power to the presidency, they would you could almost see them hold their head and say, "Oh my word, we're creating a king." But then every time they would assign a power to the Congress, to the legislature, you could almost see them put their head in their hands and say, "Oh my word, we're creating another parliament." And so they really had to create a balancing act. And this balancing act was made even more complicated because traditionally they had not thought of themselves as a country. If you asked an American in the 1780s what country he was from, he might very logically look at you and say, "I am from the country of Connecticut," or "I am from the country of Pennsylvania." They would never say they were an American. If you really pushed, they would say they were British. But to say they were an American meant they were a colony, meant that they had kind of dirt under their fingernails, Somehow they weren't as good. So framing the Constitution was no easy task. But understand that checks and balances is a key to understanding our government, how it works, but also in some ways understanding foreign policy. The Founding Fathers didn't have a lot of American history to go by, but they were experts in European history. They knew their European history. They'd seen it. They'd lived it. They knew European history like the back of their hand. And they had seen kings and queens and foreign ministers who had created standing armies and then used them. They had seen these European leaders bribe and be subject to bribes by other countries. And so they understood, and one of the geniuses of the Founding Fathers was that they understood not just government as it ought to be, but they understood government as it was. And they understood about us that we were a mix. They didn't idealize human beings and say, "Oh, humans are much too good." They said, "You know what? We are a mix. We are a contradiction of motives. We can be cruel. We can be kind. We can be generous. We can be stingy. We can be ambitious. We can be humble." And what they tried to do was create a document that understood the contradictions in human nature, the contradictions in human character. Some of you might say hypocrisies, but I like the word contradiction. It may not be as accurate, but I think it is certainly maybe a little kinder and a little more gentler. Well, what they did then with every aspect of the government was anything that a president did, Congress and the courts ultimately would have some sort of oversight. And anything that the Congress did, the president, the executive, and the court would have some sort of oversight. The court kind of has a little less oversight. Some people will say that the Supreme Court is first among equals, because really the only oversight on the court is the power of impeachment, as well as the power vested in the executive to nominate a member of the court, and the Senate of the United States to ratify that nomination. But that's pretty sparse oversight, I would say. But everything else has a check and a balance to it. In other words, a president can't do anything without saying, "Mother, may I?" And particularly, the Congress of the United States, or the Founding Fathers, I should say, wanted to put the power of treaties and the power of appointments outside the realm of the House of Representatives. That was much more argumentative and contentious and selected by us, by the way. And they wanted it instead vested in the Senate. That was never, at least not initially, elected by us. It was elected by state legislatures, the Senate was. And so what they thought was, we'll put the power of appointment ultimately to reside in the Senate, to approve or disapprove presidential appointments, not just to the cabinet, presidential appointments to the court, federal judgeships, as well as ambassadorships. And they also wanted to put the power of treaty making into the hands of the Senate, well, at least the ratification of treaties into the hands of the Senate. So the president, in some ways, can negotiate the treaty. The president can send emissaries to negotiate treaties, to negotiate with other foreign dignitaries. The president can negotiate trade deals, but it is not a deal until the Senate says yes. And so that sometimes puts foreign policy into the realm of politics, where it can be publicly argued, publicly debated, publicly scrutinized. It also means that it can also be a very slow process. It also means that it can be a very confusing process for foreign countries who don't have some of the same public arguments, public scraps, and frankly, some of the transparency that we often have in our foreign policy. It also means that foreign policy can be publicly debated and can be subject to public pressure. Another thing that foreign countries really don't understand. That one aspect of American foreign policy drives them nuts. Well, I guess that's about it. That'll give you an idea. When we talk again, unless there are other things you want to talk about, we'll talk again next week, and particularly about how Washington and Adams and Jefferson and James Monroe, the first four American presidents, are in some ways how they make the Constitution come to life, particularly for you and I in the realm of foreign policy. Oh, we're going to have some trouble with England again, and we're going to have some trouble with France, and public policy is going to be argued and debated vigorously from 1789 to 1815. Well, that's chapter 2, and we'll worry about that on the other side of this week. Hey, take a look at the syllabus. Make sure you're aware of the calendar and what is due this week. Reach out to me if you're confused or need some help. Watch the videos that I'm posting, the discussion ones, as well as the ones starring yours truly, me. And I look forward to talking to you. Have a wonderful day, wonderful night, wonderful weekend, all of that stuff. And I'll see you soon. Bye.